Hello and thank you for joining us here on Israel. I'm Ben Caspit from Tel Aviv. Many Israelis talk about the real threat to the country's democracy and even foresee its demise if Benjamin Netanyahu succeeds in his fourth attempt to gain a Knesset majority and of right-wing and ultra-Orthodox parties. According to various scenarios, this majority would allow him to push through legislation weakening the state's democratic institutions and suspending Netanyahu's trial on charges of corruption. On the other hand, Israel's democracy has proven far more resilient over the past decade than its detractors expected, and reports of its impending demise are exaggerated and premature. The Prime Minister's trial has started despite persistent efforts to postpone it, and the evidentiary stage is set for April, 2 weeks after the elections. Could Netanyahu stop a trial that has already begun? Is Israel's judicial system under real threat? Are 4 consecutive inconclusive elections cutting proof of an underlying weakness of Israel's democracy? Is Israel a deeply rooted real democracy with its different population groups fully committed to the democratic system? Or is it a patchwork of tribes, some of whom would prefer other, less democratic systems of government? Our guest today is the president of the Israel Democracy Institute. Yohanan Plesner served as an officer in the elite Sayeret Matkal unit of the IDF, as an external advisor to the longtime head of the Pentagon's Net Assessment Office, the late Andy Marshall, as a Knesset member of the Kadima Party and chair of the Knesset committee tasked with finding a solution to the problem of drafting ultra-Orthodox men. Yohanan Plesner will join me here right after a short break to talk about the situation in the country that Netanyahu and many others insist is the only democracy in the Middle East.
If you're listening to this podcast, you obviously care about the Middle East, and if you do, you should probably be reading El Monitor. El Monitor is a global newsroom headquartered in Washington, D.C., with a network of over 160 contributors around the world. El Monitor offers first-class reporting and analysis from a range of perspectives and an approach that represents the highest journalistic standards, as well as an award-winning commitment to press freedom and independence. If you haven't done so already, visit us at elmonitor.com, check out our articles, and sign up for our free newsletters. There's a lot to choose from, including the Week in Review, an essay that offers unusual insights and forecasts into the region based upon El Monitor's outstanding reporting. And if you haven't done so, please subscribe to our El Monitor podcast on your favorite podcast platform, on Israel with Ben Caspit, and on the Middle East with me, Andrew Parasolidi.
Now we are pleased to say hello to Yohanan Plesner, the president of the Israeli Democracy Institute. Shalom, Yohanan, how are you?
Hi, Ben. Shalom, and thanks for having me.
Okay, let's jump into the high waters, and I just want to ask you to start with, yes or no, is Israeli democracy under real threat in your opinion?
The answer is yes, and I'm quite hesitant to say that because over the past decade, we've witnessed many dozens of initiatives, mainly legislative initiatives, with an attempt to undermine various aspects of our democracy, rule of law, separation of power, checks and balances, aimed at civil society, rights of minorities, and so on. And we've weathered the storm by and large. The answer is yes, because right now, as we approach the upcoming election, there's about a 50-50 chance of a new government that introduced to the Israeli public a legislative package that it intends to legislate should it win a coalition led by Mr. Netanyahu. The overall effect, if this package is actually introduced to the Knesset and passed, is almost is a dramatic erosion of Israel's democratic regime. And this is what I'm very concerned about.
Do you really believe it's possible, for example, to stop a trial, a criminal trial that was already indicted and started, the new date to start the crucial phase in the Prime Minister Netanyahu trial is scheduled to early April, 2 weeks after the election. Do you think there is a possibility to hold everything and to have a new statute, maybe a retroactive statute that will, I think, first time in history, stop a trial in its midst? Isn't it fiction?
Ben, the short answer is no, and the longer answer is yes. The short answer is no because it has no precedent whatsoever in the criminal law. The trial began and it should continue. There's no court in the world that would allow for such a precedent, and no Supreme Court that would approve such a maneuver or even such legislation. But the longer answer is yes, because we have to understand that Israel's democratic regime, or Israel's democracy and its democratic makeup, is very fragile. We are a functioning democracy that we're proud of, but a democracy without a constitution. This means that a simple majority of 61 out of 120 members of Knesset can change the rules of the game fundamentally. They upset the entire institutional makeup of our state. And this means that if we have 61 MKs that are adamant and committed and would not only legislate what we call a French law, which is immunity or a halt in Mr. Netanyahu's trial, but they will also have to cut down the authorities of the Supreme Court. So the Supreme Court won't be able to intervene and cancel this decision. So this means an entire overhaul in Israel's democratic institutional makeup. Should that happen, and 61 MKs, there are no limitations to their power in our democracy, if we will have an adamant enough coalition that will want to undermine the independence of the judiciary and to go all the way, this would be inconceivable, but yet possible.
I want to have a different look for a second. Let's go to the more macro picture. And I want to ask you, is Israel a true democracy resting on strong pillars, or are we essentially a patchwork of tribes, some of them truly committed to democracy, while others preferring a different system of government, for example, like one based on a religious Jewish law?
Well, Ben, it's an excellent question. We're a true democracy. We have to remember that beyond the sort of North America and Europe, there were only 2 or 3 other countries post-World War II that had the functioning democracies, and Israel was one of these unique cases. And over the years, our democracy developed and evolved and improved. And at the same time, and now we're undergoing a crisis. There are a series of threats on our democracy. Some of those threats are threatening other advanced and developed democracies in the world. We're not the only ones that are undergoing some kind of an erosion. There are many reasons for that. We can expand on it if you wish later on. But so far we have weathered those threats. What are the 2 unique characteristics that caused me to be more worried? Number one is what I mentioned before. We do not have a constitution. The rules of the game are not etched in stone. It's not like that you need a super majority of 2/3 of the Knesset in order to change the rules of the game, or you need also approval in other houses, for example, Senate and House of Representatives. So this is number one. The rules of the game are not etched in stone. And the number 2 you mentioned is the fact that Israel's society is particularly fragmented and it has significant elements, namely the ultra-Orthodox community, that have an entirely different vision for Israel as a Jewish and democratic state. It's basically a vision that does not accept the basic assumptions of democracy as we experience them and believe in them today. So this is an underlying threat that we're dealing with. Other democracies also have a fragmented society, but not to the same extent. And therefore, while we're very proud of our democracy, we also ought not to take it for granted.
If you look around and maybe try to find me an example of a democracy that is suffering a serious danger, or is struggling, or is maybe already died, something like Turkey's Erdogan, Hungary's Orban, Russia's Putin. Which example is the most likely to be our example?
Well, first of all, we don't, we want to be optimistic and
not go there.
And it's true that many democracies cease to be can no longer be labeled democracies. If we compare just, for 20 years ago, you gave a list of countries, and we have a few countries in East Europe. You mentioned Hungary. There's Poland, another good example of countries that had fabulous constitutions with all, with extensive bills of rights and so on. And those democracies are being eroded to the extent that you can. It would be difficult to label them democracies. And at the same time, advanced democracies are being shaken, and we've seen cases in West Europe and in North America. So the entire notion of democracy is undergoing a serious change and is experiencing a serious threat. Which of the examples is best fit for Israel? I think we ought to look at the East European examples as the models that we should not learn from, but understand that under some circumstances we can find ourselves in similar situations. They're basically populist leaders that are framing their rule as a rule of a strong man representing the people against the elites, against the professional establishments, trying to represent the true nature of the nation, and in doing so, trying to undermine the free media, professional bureaucracy, civil society, independent judiciary. And Ben, since you've been covering and analyzing Israeli public life so intimately for so many years, I'm sure the list that I gave you just now sounds quite familiar.
Can you, Yohanan Plesner, settle for me or try to the contradiction that on the one hand, Israel has tried and jailed top politicians for corruption, the president, the prime minister, a finance minister, an interior minister, and many other senior officials. The incumbent prime minister is also under criminal indictment. On the other hand, Netanyahu's persistent attacks on the police, the prosecution, the attorney general, and the courts are unprecedented in their extent and strong effect. Do you think these systems have been undermined to a dangerous extent?
Yeah, well, we're very, the fact you mentioned it, that we have independent law enforcement institutions, an independent judiciary, is a privilege that most citizens of the world don't benefit from. So we're very proud of it. And even advanced countries, it's quite unique that the law enforcement institutions are that strong and that independent that they can actually indict strong public leaders. The situation of Mr. Netanyahu now is unique because it's like, an analogy of the world of banking when you take a bank through a stress testing. You test what would happen to the bank and its assets and its viability, even if very unique circumstances occurred of the decline and the fall of assets and so on. The same is with Israel, where we're experiencing a situation of a very, very popular, very savvy, very experienced prime minister, very popular among his own political base, and he's relying on this popularity and in many ways utilizing this popularity in order to affect his trial and with very few inhibitions, undermining the judiciary, attacking the state prosecutor, and not allowing for the nomination of a new independent prosecutor. I mean, as you mentioned, unprecedented maneuvers. So we can view it in both ways. One, an optimistic way. Well, under such stress and such unprecedented attacks, our systems continue to operate, the trial goes on and so on. So if we have gone through that, we can go through a lot. On the other hand, you're right that those attacks have an effect, have a chilling effect, both on the state prosecutor, on the judiciary. They're undermining those institutions and the trust in those institutions that is so necessary for them to fulfill their roles. So, it's too early to summarize, because we're really in the midst of a very big event. But no doubt those systems prove that they're strong, and at the same time, those attacks prove that they're effective. So we're in the midst of a very big event, and my hope, again, as a citizen, as head of the Israel Democracy Institute, that the institutions of rule of law, the judiciary, will preserve their independence, their professional attitude, and that the trust in those institutions will be restored.
I want to make it harder for you, Yohanan Plesner, and ask you, maybe these systems, talking about the judiciary and maybe the police and the law enforcement and the Attorney General, maybe they earned the criticism and the mistrust. Maybe Israel's legal system has earned it because, for example, years of intensive, perhaps even arrogant ruling by a Supreme Court that is endowed with too much power and intervenes in every aspect of life. The cry for reforms in the system were not answered, and this, we can blame Prime Minister Netanyahu that did not allow any reforms in the judicial system until he was indicted himself. But you know what reforms do you think are required in this regard?
Well, it's a good point. For sure, there's much fixing that can be done with our, law enforcement institutions, with the judiciary. Just take the extent of time for cases until they're heard and decided upon. The extent of time until a decision on an indictment. Many citizens undergo difficult periods and so on. So there are many areas where those systems can be improved, but the current attacks on those systems are not attacks from a productive, constructive criticism that is aimed at improving and reforming those institutions. Those are attacks that their main goal is to undermine trust and demolish trust without any constructive element in them. Not appointing a state prosecutor for 2 years or more, or more than a year is not a way to fix those institutions. That's one point about the decline of trust. Another point is that in many areas, like we've seen just last week with the decision of the Supreme Court on the conversion issue, the political system in Israel is paralyzed, does not make decisions on key matters that have to do with the identity, religion and state and so on. The court is then pulled into this vacuum because decisions need to be made, and then the court absorbs a lot of the criticism. So yes, we ought to reform the system for sure. When it comes to administrative matters, when it comes to the role of the court as a high court of justice, basically to its constitutional role, there's an urgent need to define the way we legislate basic laws, or the way we legislate chapters in the Constitution, according to which the court then makes judgments, and to define in a basic law the role of the court, how it conducts judicial review, and so on. So if there was constructive political system that would actually want to improve trust, it could have done a serious constitutional reform, serious administrative reform, and there are ideas, some of them ideas that we're promoting at the IDI, that can achieve the support of 70% of the population from the right, from the left, and from the center, and put us in a much better point of equilibrium. So Ben, this is, if you actually are concerned about the substantive matters, things can be done. But what we're seeing here is not substantive at all. It's attacks aimed at eroding, subverting those institutions, because a very strong man, namely the prime minister, is being indicted and wants to save himself.
I want to ask you a difficult question, Yohanan Plesner. You've been in politics. You've been a Knesset member from Kadima. You worked with Netanyahu. I think you chaired the committee that was supposed, to produce a new statute of drafting the ultra-Orthodox youth.
At the time, I had many Netanyahu hours.
Yes, and what do you think is going inside his mind? Is he a cold-blooded killer that is going to take the Israeli democracy hostage in order to save himself? Is he doing all these things in purpose? Because, as we knew him, he was pragmatic. He protected the system. He spoke many times about the huge importance of the Supreme Court, etc. Or does he believe in all his heart that saving himself is good for Israeli democracy, for Israeli existence, something like a messiah?
I think that this the second option makes more sense to me. I think the prime minister is at the peak of his capability, competence, political savviness. I mean, in terms of the tools of how to wield power, he's at his peak. He's also at the peak of his energies and hunger to win, and obviously stay out of jail. Now, he is, I think, if I have to sort of guess, the story that he's telling himself is that our nation is under security threat and so on, and that those capabilities that he developed are so absolutely necessary for the Jewish state that his leadership is really essential and indispensable, and therefore it justifies making all sorts of maneuvers that will save him and save his, look after his own fate. So even when he undermines those institutions, I think he lives in a sort of a narrative of those institutions really need to be sort of brought down because they're bringing me down and I have such an important role in Israel's history and so on. So there's something, I don't know if, I don't think the word Messiah is a good fit, but I think that after so many years in power, this sense of indispensability becomes an authentic emotion, and that perhaps is a good psychological reason why we should introduce the term limits. And I'm saying that, Ben, although many scholars and experts in my institute think that its term limits are not a good idea for parliamentary democracies.
And let's not forget, the guy is approaching 72, and looking at him with all his energies that you just described, working 20 hours a day, day and night, and all around. This is something unique. And
yeah, he's a force of nature. I must say, and if we compare him to his first term, where he was a lot more constrained and a lot less politically sophisticated, I think the combination of this competence on the one hand and almost absolute lack of inhibitions is a unique combination, and therefore I think our democracy is really, depending obviously on the outcome of the election, we're facing some serious threats, and I wouldn't count, Ben, on this implicit assumption that was in your question that when push comes to shove, Mr. Netanyahu will sort of demonstrate that he has some inhibitions. I think he has much inhibitions when it comes to using violent force. Sending the IDF to various military operations. But when it comes now, at this point in time, when it comes to undermining the judiciary and so on, everything is game.
Sending the IDF, maybe not, because he's not. One thing we cannot say about Netanyahu that is warmongering, but using the head of the Mossad, Yossi Cohen, to political means and missions is. He just said when we are speaking, he was interviewed in Channel 13, and said that he will use Yossi Cohen after he finishes his term in June in the government. He cannot use anyone in the government after 3 years in office. But this is we went down to the sidelines. I want to ask you a final question, Yohanan Plesner. You just spoke about the election. We are going on the March 23rd to our 4th consecutive election campaigns within 2 years. Something is not working here. I'm talking about the system. Do we need to change it?
Yeah, for sure. We're going through to a 4th election campaign because of the Netanyahu factor, which we've discussed in length. But this factor is also overlaid on top of an electoral system that has inherent strong weaknesses that need to be changed. They need to be changed in order to ensure stability, in order to ensure a decisive outcome after an election, so we will know who is prime minister, and we will have sufficient confidence that he will serve for a long time. And also we need to change the electoral system in order to ensure that the decision-making power remains with the mainstream forces and is not confiscated by single-issue parties like the ultra-Orthodox parties that today almost, you can say, have a monopoly over sub-domestic areas because of the weaknesses of our electoral system. So yeah, it requires there's a dramatic need for electoral reform, and hopefully, if a combination of right-wing, centrist, and left-wing parties builds a coalition, that can be, such a reform can be sort of offer a narrative that will connect them together. So I'm not extremely hopeful, but I can see some political scenario that can allow for that to happen.
We will have to wait and see, and first get out on the other side of the election safe. Yohanan Plesner, it was extremely interesting. Thank you very much for this conversation. We will go to a short break right now and be back shortly with some final thoughts. Thank you. Toda, Yohanan.
Thanks, Ben. Thanks for having me.
I'm Andrew Parasolidi, president of the award-winning media news site El Monitor, where we cover the Middle East with some of the best reporters and columnists anywhere. And I'm excited to announce our new podcast on the Middle East, where each week I will interview newsmakers from the U.S. and the region about the latest news and trends with additional commentary from our on-the-ground correspondents. Those of you who follow the region know that what happens in the Middle East doesn't stay in the Middle East. And to cite another great movie line, every time the U.S. tries to get out, the region pulls us back. Your time is valuable, so let me promise you this. You will learn something and you will never be bored, because each week we'll be talking with and listening to those leaders who are making the news and shaping the trends in this critical and fascinating region. So please subscribe to On the Middle East with me, Andrew Parasolidi.
Thank you for staying with us. It was a very, very worrying conversation with Yohanan Plesner that know a thing or two about Israeli democracy. He actually said, and he said he's quite hesitant to say so, that there is a real and present danger to Israeli democracy, that over the past decade, Israel have witnessed many dozens of initiatives, mainly legislative, in an attempt to undermine various aspects of Israeli democracy, things like checks and balances, civil society, rule of law, rights of minorities, etc. But right now, as we approach the upcoming elections, says Yohanan Plesner, there is a 50-50 chance of a new government that will introduce to the Israeli public a legislative package that will have an overall effect with dramatic erosion of the Israeli democratic regime. I think he also said that there is a chance, I don't know if it's a good chance, that Netanyahu will succeed in postponing or canceling his trial, an unprecedented historic thing in Israel. And when I asked him to compare Israel's democratic struggling system, to anywhere else in the world, he preferred Eastern Europe on Turkey's Erdogan. He is very worried, as many in Israel. I hope it was interesting, and I hope to meet you here next Monday, a day before the upcoming election, fourth in a row, here in On Israel. I'm Ben Caspit. Take care. Bye-bye.